Resident Evil 5 is one of the greatest co-op experiences out there. I would argue that it's way better than anything on the market these days, and it came out in like 2009. It's a pretty old video game at this point, but it still stands up as one of the best co-op experiences you can have. And believe it or not, it was probably my most played game that generation. Surprisingly, it wasn't the original Dead Space or Dead Space 2. It was actually Resident Evil 5. And I'm not really sure what that is. Whether it's the fact that it was Resident Evil 4 with more mechanics, whether it was the co-op. I'm not really sure, because I'm also not delusional with this game. While I do really like Resident Evil 5, I also see that it has a ton of issues. The main one being that it literally has no atmosphere. Barely any atmosphere throughout, and it just doesn't work with what it's trying to be. So, I would be lying if I said that I got scared by horror games anymore. Sure, when I was a kid, I used to find them scary. But now it just doesn't work. So it's not the reason I play this genre. The reason I play the genre is for the atmosphere and for the gore. And for the most part, Resident Evil delivers on this all the time. The Resident Evil 5 is no different from, say, Resident Evil 4. With its gore, it's about the same. There's not too much there. So I'm getting my impact, my enemies being disgusting to fight. It's got some pretty cool enemy designs, but for the most part, it's exactly the same as Resident Evil 4, but where it feels compared to Resident Evil 4 is that atmosphere. The atmosphere is just missing, man. And it sucks. It really, really sucks, because you can see the potential that Resident Evil 5 has. Now, the rumor mill's kicked off again, and it's really heavily sounding like Resident Evil 5 is the next one to do the remake treatment. And I'm not against it, just so we're clear. I was definitely the person that was like, oh, why are we remaking Resident Evil 4? It's a 10 out of 10 video game. It's one of the best video games of all time. Why would we remake this? And I definitely sort of ate my words. I'm not going to sit here and tell you the remake is better than the original, but I'm also not going to sit here and tell you that the original's better than the remake. I think both games are absolutely superb, and that remake has really grown on me. At first, it was a little bit like, I don't know about these little bits, because I don't like change. Who likes change? And you're messing with something that I'm absolutely in love with. But with Resident Evil 5, while I do really like the video game, and I have a really good time when I play it, I can see the issues, so I can also see the potential that it has in a remake where we could fix the atmosphere, man. Resident Evil 5 is baked in daylight. It is constantly in broad daylight, and it just hammers the atmosphere to bits. There's just no way to be creeped out, man. There's no atmospheric music. There's no nothing. There's barely any sound. Plus, when you get in any, like, combat encounter, music is always playing like you've just got into a battle in Final Fantasy, and some kind of like music starts playing, like battle theme. And it's just like, why are we doing this in a quote-unquote horror video game? So it does annoy me a little bit, because it's like, you can play music, but that music better be like, you know, like haunting. It can't be action theme 22. It just doesn't work, and then it stops, and then nothing's happening, and then you get into another fight, and the music kicks off again. It's just something that Resident Evil 5 does way too much. And Resident Evil 5 was kind of like an uphill battle anyway, because Resident Evil 4 is arguably like the greatest game ever made. So trying to compete with that, trying to be a sequel to that, especially when Mikami wasn't even involved with this game, it's kind of crazy. The fact that it does co-op, a lot of people will argue saying that horror and co-op do not work. I disagree. Dead Space 3, I know some people hate that game, does horror co-op so fucking well. If you have not played Dead Space 3 in co-op, you're missing out. I don't want to spoil it for you, but that game is legendary when it comes to co-op. That being said, it's not Resident Evil 5 legendary, where it's just replayability is just there all the time. You just want to keep replaying it, getting new weapons and just changing it up and unlocking stuff, trying the different difficulties. It's got all these iconic moments. Resident Evil 5 has so much potential. There was just, they just let it down. The developers had bad direction. They kind of were just pushing towards what was in at the time, like the Gears of War and whatnot, and they were like, you know what, maybe we'll need to like lean into the action. Seems to be the action is why everyone liked Resident Evil 4. Let's lean into it. And don't get me wrong, it clearly paid off because Resident Evil 5 was one of the best-selling Resident Evil games of all time. But it fucked the horror up, didn't it? It was the horror that was the biggest problem. But if we remake it and we hammer the horror home, we fix the atmosphere and make the gore a little bit toned up, make it in nighttime, less daylight, we could seriously have top 5 Resident Evil games of all time. I know some people probably be like, Resident Evil 5 is already top 5, and I get where you're coming from. Very good game, but it needs the atmosphere fixed. It really does, and we could really have something great. That's how I feel about it anyway, so I'm really not against them remaking it. How do you feel? Let me know down below. If you even like Resident Evil 5, I know a lot of people can't stand Resident Evil 5 because of what it is. It's like heavy action. I get it. Not going to argue with you. But yeah, let me know down below how Resident Evil 5 makes you feel, and if you want that remake, because let's be real, we all do, don't we? Yeah, anyway, that's all I got, people. I'll catch you later.